today for this webinar. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and today we're discussing part of the Crisis Coach webinar series, when your first company crisis is your crisis manager's first crisis. This is part of our 2015 series of webinars that we present in conjunction with the New Jersey MEP, and we're pleased to have you with us. We also invite you to become our friend at Facebook. We're known as Firestorm Solutions on Facebook, and we're Firestorm Soul on Twitter. Yes, there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And this work product must be reviewed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. And this information should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is pleased to have an ongoing relationship with the New Jersey MEP. They're the co-host, sponsor, underwriter of this series. You can watch past webinars in this series by going to firestorm.com. You can also register for future webinars in the series. Our presenter today is going to be Susie Laughlin, and we will introduce her right after we hear from Joe Caratanudo and Blair Neville. Joe, over to you, please.
Thanks, Bill. For those of you who are not familiar, New Jersey Manufacturing Extension Program, its mission is to focus on small, mid-sized manufacturers, working with them to help them improve their productivity, efficiency, and also their global competitiveness. And we do it through a host of different services that we provide in areas like energy, R&D tax credits, lean manufacturing, Six Sigma. We also get involved in strategic planning and business development and helping companies bring new products to market. But also we do get involved in business continuity planning, which is the reason we're here today. And we do offer a risk assessment, which is available through NJMEP in conjunction with Firestorm at no cost to manufacturers in the state of New Jersey. So Blair, over to you.
Great, Joe. Thank you very much. And again, I'd just like to thank the New Jersey MEP for supporting this. It's a very important topic, and your commitment to it has gone a long way. We've done some worked with a few companies and have done some great things with them here in New Jersey. And without your support, that would be hard to do. Today's discussion is going to be very interesting, and we have a special presenter here today. For those of you who might be on the phone that have attended a few of the webinars, Susie Laughlin is going to be our presenter today, and I'm going to hand it back over to Susie.
Thanks, Blair, and thanks, Joe. Nice to meet everybody.
Let me introduce you, please.
Go ahead, Bill.
This is Susie Laughlin. Susie is Executive Vice President and co-founder of Firestorm. She's also the Chief Administrative Officer, and she is in fact located just north of New York City, so she knows how to speak the language in New Jersey. Susie, over to you now.
I don't know, that might have been a little stretched there, the last part, but I'll try. Although I think we're all rooting for the same sports teams right now, so that's a good thing. And Blair and Joe, I encourage you both, as we go through the presentation, please chime in. And Karen Masulo, who's our EVP and Director of Business Intelligence, I know she's listening in as well. And to the extent we get on a topic that anyone else wants to jump in on and give some examples, that would be wonderful. Thank you. This is the first time I've had an opportunity to speak with your group, and I've heard a lot about you through Blair, so I look forward to it. So today we're going to talk about crisis management in particular. We're going to talk about, what we try to do in Firestorm when we have a client that's in crisis, and of course that's always for the client a terrible thing, but oftentimes there is a way through the way we handle and respond to a crisis to actually transform it into some kind of value. And by that I mean that the company could actually emerge stronger, better, as a result of the way they handled what occurred. So today we'll focus on some strategies on how do we actually transform crisis into value. Before we get into that, though, I want to just start with some terminology, because I always want to make sure that my audience is familiar with the words I'm using and make sure we're all on the same page. So I know you've had several sessions with Firestorm, and perhaps you've seen this slide before. What I like about the slide is it lays out the process, where you'll see that we have some type of an event that occurs. And by the way, not every crisis is preceded by an emergency, but in this case, let's say the event is something like a fire, a weather event, a storm, a tornado. Something triggers an emergency response where we're really thinking about life safety. We're thinking about, protecting people and property. And that emergency response plan is usually meaning we're evacuating, we might be sheltering in place. Something has to happen in order to protect our people and our assets. And once those initial seconds, minutes are over, we're in that stage where what we call crisis management, which is figuring out what just happened to us, what were the impacts, were people hurt, was property damaged, what are the decisions we have to make, who do we need to communicate with. And that period could last a day or two. And typically in that period, you're really figuring out now, you're dusting off that business continuity plan that hopefully, as Joe mentioned, there's an assessment process, but that business continuity plan is really the document that you've created, the process you've created to recover critical functions that may have been taken out as a result of that event. So the crisis management phase is really that piece in the middle. And that's what we're going to focus on in today's webinar. And by the way, if anyone has questions, Bill, if I remember correctly, they can submit them as we go through this. There's a chat feature in the software, and Bill will be able to read those out loud when the time comes. So please don't hesitate along the way if you have a question to send that in. So what is a crisis? What does it feel like to be in a crisis? Well, usually things are moving very, very rapidly. And unfortunately, they are moving in a way that doesn't often afford us all the information we would want to have. And even worse, at times the information is inaccurate. What we also know about a crisis in many situations is we're dealing with tremendous pressure that could come from all kinds of places. It could be the media, it could be our customers, it could be our employees, it could be the public. And when you're under such intense scrutiny, at the same time as you're trying to figure out what to do about what just occurred, you're really at a loss. You're really trying to figure out, what do I do? What do I say? And what results in all of this, by the way, what I'm describing is what happens when you don't have a plan, when you haven't thought through these issues. So what happens is you kind of lose command and control, especially if the event were the kind of event where first responders come in and pretty much they take over. And what does that mean? Well, it really depends. If it's a police event, if you had like an episode of workplace violence, they're going to control. If it's a fire, obviously you're going to have the first responders from the respective fire units come in. But that loss of command and control is a very difficult thing to watch. And it doesn't have to happen. It's something you can maintain even with the first responders, but it's, again, something you would have had to plan for, something you would have had to coordinate with them in advance so that you and they know what to expect when they arrive at your facility. The way you communicate about the crisis, oftentimes I have to tell you, this is where we see the next crisis. We have a saying, the way you communicate about don't let the first response become your next crisis. And regrettably, that's what happens in many situations where a lot of thought hasn't gone into the planning. You can rest assured your brand and reputation will be under attack, whether that's in your within your supply chain, your employees, your customers. And every crisis, I think, uniquely, what it has in common is that every crisis, no matter what it is a human crisis because it impacts people. So, unfortunately, the other bad thing about the environment we're in now, and this becomes a real struggle, which I'm going to spend some time talking about a little later, is this silence equals guilt idea. In the media, when people don't comment or don't return calls, oftentimes the perception of the reader might be, well, they have something to hide and therefore we're not talking. Unfortunately, that, that may be the perception, but it may be that that's a better choice than actually talking, and we'll spend more time on that. And lastly, surprise. Jim always, those of you who've dealt with Jim, I'm sure you've heard his joke that he says all the time, that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. I don't know about Jim. I probably still like surprises until I hit about 40, and after that it was enough. But in any event, in a crisis environment, a surprise is really never good in any kind of business. So, as I mentioned, in the first 24 hours, what we're dealing with is typically wrong information or incomplete information. And the unfortunate thing about that is that although we don't have all the information we'd like to have, we nevertheless have to make decisions. And those decisions, at that point in time, can really create long-term consequences for years and years to come. So what do I mean by that? Maybe we made a decision in the first 24 hours that led us to give a statement, a public statement, that later on we wish we had not made because perhaps some of the information in it was wrong. The days of just kind of moving on from that don't exist because that statement is indelibly etched now into the media, into the internet forever. And anytime someone searches your organization, they will come upon that story. So that would be an example of a consequence that flows from your choosing to speak about something with incomplete information. There are different kinds of crises. Some crises are more targeted where it's easy to identify what occurred. It typically would not be complex unless it was ineffectively managed, and the way you deal with it is more straightforward. In some businesses, a sexual harassment claim against a manager could be a crisis. But that is something that with appropriate HR protocols and investigation procedures that you can manage and prevent it from turning into something much worse. So how you deal with that, there's a clear path on how a targeted crisis should be handled. You could have a supply chain, one provider in your supply chain that has been impacted, let's say, by a natural disaster or something that's caused a delay in their ability to provide you what you need. That's something very targeted. Hopefully you've thought through your supply chain. Hopefully you either have figured out that you can make it for a couple of days or you figured out an alternative source. And only if you haven't done that would that type of a crisis become complex. A complex crisis really has a lot of things happening at once, and sometimes they're competing. You might have a data breach, where the customer has a need for information, but at the same time, there may be a regulatory requirement that you need to do certain steps first. In a complex crisis, there's much more pressure to make sure you handle it the appropriate way, and it usually requires more of a sophisticated response. The other difference is that, in some crises, the reaction time is different, where sometimes you have more time to make decisions. Perhaps the event is not all-consuming. Again, let's use that supply chain disruption or, one piece of equipment that's damaged that you can pay attention to. But you're typically able to carry on other business functions while that crisis is occurring, as opposed to another type of crisis where you have extreme urgency and everyone is involved in how they mitigate it, and that could be something really catastrophic, and it's certainly going to be all-consuming. Regardless of which type of a crisis you have, there's a right way and a wrong way to handle it, and the things here on the slide really talk to what you need to have in place, whether your business is small or large, and it might be that one person wears multiple hats in the organization, whereas in some of your other organizations that are larger, you may actually have crisis teams. I would encourage even the smaller businesses to ensure that you have 2 or 3 people, preferably 3, that are multidisciplinary, across the organization. Typically, someone who is focused on the people issues, the HR, the operations, the facility, if there's a security piece, if there's a legal piece, depending again on your size. But what's very important is that command and control we talked about earlier. Command and control means things are going to be done in an orderly fashion. Someone's in charge. And by that, we say in Firestorm that, you need a general. Someone has to serve as that general, and that may be the person you designate as your crisis manager. And the theme of today is really making sure that we've given thought to who that crisis manager will be. And I'll move on a little bit and talk to you about some of the attributes that we see in a crisis of people that have done a good job handling them. But you want to appoint your general. You want to be able to identify all your vulnerabilities. What just happened to us, and what do we need to start thinking about? Who are the people we need to talk to? What are the decisions we need to make? And who's our spokesperson? Who's going to the extent we are going to be speaking, and I don't mean the media, I mean internally. You're going to have key employees that you're going to have to talk to. In fact, all employees in most crises. You're going to need to speak to customers. You're going to need to speak to suppliers. You may need to speak to regulators. You may have an OSHA, regulator. I mean, there are all kinds of people. So spokesperson is not a term reserved just for speaking with the media. In fact, in most occasions, we don't see a lot of value that comes from talking through the media. It would be a very catastrophic event that we would see a situation requiring media conversation. And the reason we say that is because the days of needing the media to deliver your messages are really behind you. Most of us in our businesses know who our stakeholders are. We have a way of communicating with our employees directly, our customers directly, our supply chain directly. We don't need the media to accomplish that. And the world is different now. Media has somewhat been marginalized. They're more about entertainment than they are about delivering news. So if we view the media as something that can carry our message, we will surely be disappointed. So understanding who those constituents are that we need to communicate with, and missing one, it really can be catastrophic. I'll give you an example, and clearly this is, I realize, a very big difference from the businesses you're in, but it illustrates a really good example of missing a constituent group. When Firestorm responded to the shootings at Virginia Tech, we came in 36 hours later, and our role was crisis communications and helping them deal with the aftermath of what occurred. And there was utter chaos in the environment, hundreds and hundreds of media outlets. Of course, we had a horrific tragedy with many, many losses of people, students, faculty. The campus was really in a grief-stricken, shocked state. And I assure you, making decisions was impossible for anybody who worked there. So, the goal is for a firm like ours to come in and say, well, who are our stakeholders? Who do we need to communicate with? And one of the things that Firestorm recognized that the university had not was that the shootings occurred on April 16th. And for those of you, obviously, who may have sent kids to college or have gone to college, you'll remember perhaps that May 1st is the day that all high school seniors have to either tell you they're coming or not coming to Virginia Tech. And at the time, there were 12,000 acceptance letters outstanding. And there were 12,000 families who were thinking about whether or not I should send my son or daughter to Virginia Tech. And that was a stakeholder group that was not obvious. So what Firestorm was able to do was work with the university to help mount a campaign that would actually lead to outreach to every single high school senior that had had an acceptance letter, mobilizing alumni and students and parents and faculty, you name it. And, the good news was that Virginia Tech had a much higher conversion rate, almost double the conversion rate that they had had in prior years. But that, the future of Virginia Tech, literally, had they lost that class, it would have had a catastrophic impact to the university. That would have been examples of consequences that would have been there long into the future. So the best time to identify constituents and figure out what the messaging will be is long before the event occurs. And the time to do that is really now. It's when you don't have your heart beating out of your chest because something bad has already happened. where you can think clearly and optimally. And that's what crisis management planning is all about. It's about getting all your ducks in a row so that when, and hopefully it doesn't, but it's more likely a when, not an if, a bad event occurs, you'll be ready. Because otherwise, really what the result is, without that type of planning, you can be assured that there'll be damaging statements, exposures will definitely be missed, we'll miss constituents, and things will fall through the cracks. And unfortunately also in a crisis, there's really just a very short period of time you have, like I said, within that 24, 48-hour period, but even those very first initial hours are so crucial, especially for communicating internally with our people, because our people need to know that you're on top of this, that you are focused on managing the consequences and protecting, frankly, the goodwill that you've earned of your business and making sure that your business is there long into the future. So we want to make sure that we focus on those golden minutes initially. In a crisis, it's also, as I said earlier, what you know is probably much, much less than what you don't know. So you're going to be forced to be making decisions based on bad choices. Do I choose bad choice A or do I choose bad choice B? Because in a crisis, for the most part, they're all bad choices. I can give you an example of a matter that I was involved in recently. I'm not a manufacturer, but it was a bank. And this bank, a wonderful reputation, has been in business for a very long time. They had a situation where a customer fell on very hard times, but there was a lot of controversy around the customer. And that controversy dragged in the bank because the bank had made a loan to that customer. And the press was reaching out for comment from the bank. And initially, they had reached an employee in the bank, and that employee had promised to return a call to the reporter because the bank, in fairness, was very concerned about what people in the community thought about their role with this company that was going down. And there was a bit of an issue around breach of trust with that company, which the bank did not, wanted to kind of set the record straight that they were not a part of. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, since the media is not about delivering news, but rather entertainment, the media is really not interested in telling the side of the story that doesn't have a lot of, that's not going to garner the kind of interest from the public that a story would if they could go out there and say, well, the bank must have known, or the bank was in cahoots, or whatever. So the bad choice A that they had to decide was, do we call the customer? Do we call this reporter back? And if so, who calls them and what do they say? There was board members that wanted to call back because they couldn't bear the thought that the paper would write something that said the bank didn't return calls because they were afraid, again, that it looked like they were hiding. And this is back to that silence equals guilt comment I made earlier. And then bad choice B was, we give them something. We give them an email. We give them a short written statement telling them that, we can't talk about our customers and our loans because it's a matter of privacy. But what we can tell you is, our bank's been in business for X amount of years, and we're dedicated to servicing the needs of the business community. You could say all these wonderful things about the bank. And then the final choice was, you go tit for tat with them and actually tell them why they're wrong about certain things. But again, remember, you can't really breach the privacy, so bad choice C was really, really, in the end, not an option, although several people would have preferred that. Fortunately, we had a CEO that was decisive, and we'll talk about the importance of being decisiveness in a few minutes. Being decisive is important because a decision does need to be made. So the decision that was made was to go with bad choice B, which was, that we're going to give them a little something. We're not going to ignore them, but we're going to give them a little something. And it was along the lines I previously described to you. And what the result was the next day there was an article in the paper, a very scathing article about the customer, and of course it dragged in the bank. And because the bank actually returned not so much that they returned the call, but they sent an email. The result was that the reporter was able to put a picture of one of the employees of the bank, big headshot in there, and under it, it just said that the bank cannot talk about, customer information. But because they heard from the bank, they were able to put the picture in, and then because they heard from the bank, on the 1+, yes, they put in that good quote about we've been in business for a long time and we're here to serve the community, but they didn't put in a lot of the other information that talked about why they weren't engaging in this. And so it was good and bad. The bad choice A, in our opinion, would have been preferable, because although there would have been a reference to the fact that the bank didn't return the phone call, that would have been the end of it. Instead, now there's, just this headshot out there and more of an association that every time that story runs, people will see more connectivity when they search the internet because of both the image and the quote from the bank. So long story, but I think making the point that you always have to say to yourself, why media? So crisis management is really about making decisions. We always have to ask ourselves, why are we communicating? In every situation, we do not have to communicate. And I'll show you a few more examples of why there are times you really don't want to. So Firestorm's methodology, I know you've heard this before in these webinars, is predict, plan, perform. And predict is really thinking through, in this case, in a crisis, you got to think about, well, what's going to happen next? If we do this, what's the next thing that will occur? What are the plans we need, even the short-term plans? I'm not talking about those lengthy plan documents, but I mean a plan might be that, okay, this manager is going to be meeting with this group of employees to talk about what occurred in our plant. Perform is, again, identifying what we need to do, what we need to say. And you'll always be asking yourself these questions all the time. What do you know? That is the most important question to be mindful of in crisis management. We don't want to make decisions unless we know something. So by that I mean, if you hear a little voice in your brain saying, well, I think, or I believe, or I assume, any of those qualifying words should set off warning bells in your head. If you don't know the basis upon which you're going to be making a decision, don't make it. It may be worse to make it than to wait. So, of course, you're always going to say to yourself, what do I know? Am I concerned? What am I concerned about? If I make this statement, just like we did the analysis with the bank, what are we concerned about? By the way, in that story, the good news was that it got very little traction. No one really cared about the story, which is hard to believe when you're in the throes of a crisis. They got very lucky. It just didn't get legs. I assure you, if they had opted for C, it would have gotten a lot of legs. And then monitoring. Throughout a crisis, we always have to pay a lot of attention to what is going on. And what do we mean by that? Well, we would monitor social media. We want to know, what are our customers saying? Maybe even in our supply chain, people are talking. What are our employees saying? Employees, have the right to communicate with each other, and they may be saying things. We want to know what people are saying, because that's going to give us insight into further actions we need to take. And it'll help us decide who do we need to communicate with going forward. If we did have a very bad event occur, something horrific, I dealt a month ago with a suicide in the workplace of a very senior person in the organization. The impact was tremendous. It occurred in the workplace, and there were employees that were part of the aftermath where they saw the person, they dealt with the family coming in, that they were traumatized. And there was a real need to bring in services like psychological first aid. But the point is, you can't presume that just because you brought in a counselor for 2 hours to talk to your employees that everything is okay. In fact, it's really not. And the monitoring of how they are doing, having these touch points, knowing who's going to be reaching out to people after there's been a tragic event, is very, very important. So depending on the nature of the crisis, it will determine what your monitoring strategy will be. So where do you start as it relates to your crisis manager? Because that's really the crux. I felt it was important to give you the background before we move into what this person's job is going to be, so to speak. So as you can see, somebody has to be very decisive. They have to be a person that's at ease with making decisions. And by the way, going back to that bank CEO who chose between A, B, and C, they were all bad choices. He made a choice. It might not have been the one I would have made. It certainly wasn't the one his chairman wanted him to make, but he made one. And that characteristic is important. There are statistics out there. There was a book I read once that I think it was called something like When Disaster Strikes. Amanda Ripley was her name, and she studied the survival rates of people after disasters, like what made some people survive a plane crash or some other horrific event, a hotel fire. And what they learned in studying all of this is that 10% of the people are natural leaders, 80% are followers, and 10% will do absolutely nothing. They'll be paralyzed. So, just because you have a very senior executive in your firm or an owner of your firm perhaps, as great as it was that they got to that stage of their career, that doesn't mean they are going to be able to make the kinds of decisions that have to be made in these difficult moments. And the purpose of test exercises, I'm sure Jim and Blair, Joe, you've probably talked to this group about test exercises, but the great thing that comes by doing test exercises and simulations of crises is that even in that environment, you'll get a sense of who's comfortable making decisions and who isn't. So that person needs to be decisive, they need to have good communication skills, they have to be someone that's viewed as somebody with expertise that people are willing to follow and listen to, somebody that has good professional relationships within the organization, someone that perhaps is already characterized as a leader, someone who's credible, knowledgeable about the emergency, someone who could be able to either have the subject matter expertise you need or oversee someone with subject matter expertise. So again, you might have those first responders coming in. You may have the police department that comes in after you've had an executive arrested for possession of child pornography. I can't tell you how many times that happens. And at first you think, is that a crisis? I assure you it's a major crisis. One of the things that will happen is the police will come in and they'll say, well, I want his computer. Well, do you have to give them the computer? They're the police, right? You think you do. The answer is maybe, maybe not right away, maybe not until you've had a forensic expert look at the computer so that you can validate what's on there. Maybe not until you remove some certain sensitive data, whether it's HIPAA information or other medical information or employment records or things that frankly have nothing to do with the matter at hand. So having a person who's willing to take control and be able to direct the authorities, the regulators, as well as everyone internally is very important. And of course, someone who's resourceful.
Susie?
Yeah.
This is Blair. I want to make a little comment on that, in that a large number of the businesses that the NJMEP deal with are small to medium-sized businesses at best, and that's a difficult conversation. We've had that instance, and we've dealt with it where you might be speaking with the owner of the business or someone who's been there for 40 years and is a CEO, and they're there for a reason. They can make decisions. They're dynamic. They have the control, and it's a tough discussion to have. So as you build a plan and you put these plans together, one of the things you have to face is that that person may not be the right person to lead this, and I say that in the sense that that's a very difficult discussion for a general manager who might be putting this together, or an HR manager, to say, hey, that the CEO is maybe not the best person, and we should have someone else be the crisis manager. And I just say that it can be a very tough discussion to have, but it's something that you are faced with, and you need to have the discussion. Now, you may very well be the right person, but you have to go through that process.
It's a great point, and it's the same thing with the spokesperson. Oftentimes people will be quick to say, well, let's make the CEO our spokesperson. And I would suggest to you that for most crises, the ones that are not the catastrophic ones, I would say not to make it your CEO or your highest ranking person, because just going back to the bank, we purposely made sure that the statement came from a lower level executive because we did not want to create the perception that this matter was so critical to the bank that it warranted the CEO to give the comment. So the other thing is you always want the spokesperson to be able to say that I have to go one step higher to get information or approval. And if you make your top person the spokesperson, you won't be able to have that ability. So there's a lot of reasons, but what happens is in the crisis management planning process, all of this gets determined, you know, and I'll tell you something also, it has to do a lot with your personality. Sometimes, we work with a lot of schools, you know, we've dealt with a lot of shootings and horrific things. If your nature is if your nature is one that's more nurture, meaning if something bad happened at your plant, people were hurt, you're going to want to, if you're the kind of person that knows for a fact that you're going to want to be out there dealing with the families and dealing with the victims, you don't want to be sequestered in a room, which is where your crisis management team will be, then you're not the best person to be the crisis manager. So again, thinking through the types of things that could go wrong in the organization, the events that follow, all of that's important. And the more thought that has gone into it, the quicker you'll be able to get into gear and start acting. And there are many roles you have. You know, the crisis manager has to manage the overall effort. They're dealing with impact reports. You know, they're getting updates all the time on what did we learn, what new facts do we have, what damages are there, what is the state of the medical condition of our people that might have been hurt. Hopefully you know that whenever you have an employee that's been sent to the hospital that you always send somebody with them, you know, a senior person. You don't want the family to have to interact with anyone but a senior level person from the organization or an owner. You want to be able to ensure that the way you're recovering, hopefully you have a business continuity plan because that's going to map out for you all the steps you're going to take to recover your operations. But this crisis manager will be making sure that all of these things are happening in lockstep with your business continuity planning people. You'll be looking at communications, and you'll be thinking about legal and compliance. And the good thing is you don't have to remember everything that's on here if you have a crisis management plan, because if you have one, there'll be checklist formats that list all of these things, but specific to your organization. It's not something that you can just like download off the internet and have a checklist. It's got to be your checklist, something that really aligns with the impacts on your business and the steps you have to take. So coordinating, you know, with all of your people, that's your job as the crisis manager. And there's going to be a bunch of questions you're going to be asking yourself over and over again. I mean, these are just some of them that come to mind. You know, what's occurred, what do we know? Again, back to what do we know? What's going to happen next? If you remember nothing else from this whole session, please remember that one phrase, what do we know? It really will change the way you handle every decision you make from here on forward, whether it's even dealing with your kids or anything else. It's a great strategy. What are the metrics? You know, metrics are important. That means how do we know if our messaging is working? You know, like with the bank, the great thing that happened there was we were able to see there was so little traction on social media that we were able to say, you know what, guys, this was the right tack. You did a good job. You made the right decision. And now move on. Just put it behind you and don't re-engage with anyone. People will go on to the next story, so will the reporter. So, but you wouldn't know how that's going unless you're really watching to see what are people saying or doing. So, you know, these are all the things we've already talked about. There are lots of actions, you know, that you'll be responsible for. Establishing the command and control. That means, you know, getting your team of your crisis team. By the way, a crisis manager doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's hopefully a predefined group of people that you've selected that are your crisis team. And the other reason it's very important to have a group of people is that someone else may have actually been impacted by the crisis on your team, or they might not be available. Maybe the crisis happened when John was on vacation in Cancun. I mean, Murphy's Law, I can tell you that happens over and over again. So you want a crisis team that's multidisciplinary, someone typically from operations, like I said, facilities, security, HR. And this group of people, they kind of, yes, they bring their own expertise with them to the table, but by being a member of the team, it means that you're willing to make decisions even in subject areas you may know nothing about if that team member doesn't show up. So establishing that command and control, gathering the people, whether it's on a conference call because something happened after hours, or whether it's in the plant or it's some off-site location you've designated as a meeting place, that would be the role of the crisis manager.
Susie?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Blair again. I hate interrupting you, but I wanted to make another quick comment. Again, kind of focusing back on the New Jersey environment, given that a lot of the companies are, small to medium size. One thing I've noticed in working with them is that they have a lot of bench strength in that a lot of the people, the general managers and the manufacturing managers, they wear a lot of hats. So cross-training is important to them, and they're good at it. The problem is they don't have a big bench.
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of reiterating what you're saying is you do have to cross-train, and people have to be able to step up to do a number of things. So as part of your plan, it's important to do that 3 deep, 4 deep even, because you don't have a lot of bodies.
And that's a great point, Blair. Great point, because I can relate to that, having grown up in a family business myself, where I remember plenty of times, over the literally 5 decades that I lived through it, that lots of your crisis management was done around your dining room table. It might be that some of you have family businesses, and your crisis team, so to speak, is your family. Whatever those people are that you trust and rely on. To Blair's point, they all need to be able to understand their roles and responsibilities in a crisis, and you want it to be predefined so that there really is no surprise for anyone. But you're right, Blair. This methodology can be applied whether you're a company with 5 people, 100, 1,000, 10,000. So this list has, the many things that the crisis management plan would set forth as the kind of your to-do list, the things that the crisis manager has to pay attention to. And we talked about the decision making. We've talked, one last thing, an area is the crisis communications, and I know we're coming on, we have just a handful of minutes left, so I want to be mindful of the time. Again, it's back to that why question. Before you start explaining, explaining is a term we say in Firestorm, explaining is losing. When you hear somebody start explaining why something went wrong, even in your day-to-day life, I'm sure you know what your brain does. You kind of tune it out already. You're like, I don't even want to hear why you're explaining. Just tell me how you're going to fix it and how I know this is never going to happen again. That's really what you want to know. Now, at some point, do you want to do an after-action review to perhaps really delve into why the bad thing happened so you could learn about it and improve your plans and your day-to-day operations? Sure. But at the time of the crisis, this is not a time to explain anything. Just like the bank couldn't explain away the fact that they made a loan that went bad. You can't explain that away. So let's talk about, what you do going forward. And always ask why, whether you're going to communicate, no matter who you're going to communicate with, before you do it, say to yourself, why am I communicating with this person? What's the goal of that? And in crisis communication, there's different types of communication. You have the first part, which is really like coordinating, the initial communications around coordinating the crisis. Then you have communications that deal with how we're going to respond and recover. And then you have communications that deal with the fact that you may have regulators. You could have an OSHA inspector. Someone shows up after you've had a fire or something happened, and they're asking all kinds of questions. So there's different types of communications. And knowing that, you want to make sure then you've given thought, who are your audiences? What will they be concerned about? What's that OSHA inspector concerned about? What are the things I'm going to say to that inspector or to my employees or to the family of a victim? What am I going to say? What do they want to hear? What's going to make sense? And then don't ever give more than like 3 talking points. Nobody can remember more than that. Sometimes you only need 1, but you definitely don't ever need more than 3. And, I think, again, I'm back to driving home why this is so important to get your plan in order before things happen, is because, really minutes count in a crisis, but sometimes it's really the seconds in the minutes, because again, it's those seconds that lead to, frankly, impulsive, reactionary type of decisions and comments that come back to haunt us. So as I said earlier, we don't want our first response to become the second crisis. One last thing I want to mention about communications: if anything bad ever does happen at your company, don't Google yourself. don't go out there and Google like the name ABC manufacturer and fire, for example, in Google. Google will give a lot of credit to that type of search, and in the future when one of your customers wants to decide whether they're going to use ABC manufacturing, that story will come up every time. So the last thing you want to do is go out there after something bad has happened. You might have had a sexual harassment claim that got public. You might have had an employee that got arrested for pornography. You could have had an act of workplace violence. Don't go out and Google yourself. Crisis management is, you know, this is a chart, and I know this is like a frightening thing to look at, but it actually does make sense when you have time to go through it. And Blair, this is the kind of thing that maybe at some point when you do your sessions with the organization, you'll have time to take them through. But there really is a logic to the process, and I think if you think it through and go through it in a way that aligns with your company, you're going to find that it's kind of like, how do you eat the elephant? Because I know this, all of what I've talked about today sounds like a really gigantic elephant that you don't know what to do with, and it's really one bite at a time. You know, pre-action is really like, these are all the things you can do now. What do I need to do now to get ready for an event? What are the things that can go wrong? What are the plans I need? What are the things I have to have in place? Onset is, okay, now it happened. What do we do? That's usually that emergency response piece. Impact assessment, what's the damage? Do I need my insurance agent? What do I need? And then that's it. Do we have a crisis or don't we? If we have a crisis and we have to start restoring functions, now we're in our response and recovery, which is our business continuity mode, which we have plans for. And finally, that consequence management is, you know, all the things. How do we talk about what happened to us? How do we make the decisions? How do we get, frankly, ourselves back to the, you know, doing business the way we did before this happened? And I go back now to that transforming crisis into value. Will we be the same company if something catastrophic happened? No. We say, okay, you have a new normal, but maybe that new normal is something stronger, something better, because of what you've been through and because of the way you handled it. I'm not going to spend time on this. This is a way that you can actually evaluate your culture to determine where you are from a maturity standpoint in your business as it relates to crisis management. And I think we make these slides available, so at some time you might want to take a look at this and kind of figure out where you would fall, because I think it will give you an idea of the work you have to do that lies ahead of you. So again, predict. Remember, that's all the things we want to figure out. What can go wrong in our company? What are the things we're vulnerable to? Plan. What do we need to have in place so that if those things materialize? Do we need a workplace violence plan? Do we need to know what we do if someone comes in with a communicable illness? The CDC's warning about measles. Apparently we have lots of people that aren't vaccinated for measles, which is hard to believe, but that's the case. It could be, you know, like a cyber breach. What do we do if we've got some data breach where customer information has been disclosed? And finally, perform is really to make sure we're ready when the time comes. And the way we get ready is by doing test exercises and practicing our plans and making sure we have all the messaging in place so that we're good to go. So at this point, you all have, I guess, some homework. You know, try to figure out where you are with your program, enhance it, because I don't think any of us really can afford not to. If you, at this point, Bill, I don't know if you want to talk about the upcoming virtual exercises that are planned, but Firestorm regularly does some sessions where you can participate in exercises that are interactive, and I'm sure you'll get more information
Let me jump in here, Susie. On December 8th and December 14th, we're having sessions where you can participate in a virtual exercise with a team within your organization. The concentration on this one will be cyber security and a cyber event. The December 8th and 14th, you don't do both of them. You pick out which one is going to be convenient for your organization. And then you can align your plans to best practices and participate in designing an intelligence network. This is something that we promised that we would do. There is no fee to this. We do expect that you will assemble your team and prepare for this well ahead of time. Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Bill. Well, I want to say thank you to the organization, NJMEP, and to Joe, Blair, and Bill, and Karen, everyone who helped put this together. And it was my pleasure to be a part of it. And I hope you will all have a good day. I think there's information you'll be able to download. Karen, is there anything we need to talk about here, or they know the drill?
You did a great job. Thank you so much, Susie. We all appreciate it.
Okay. Well, take care, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Susie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.